The man who had executed a king was about to face his own executioner, but this one came from within his own body. On September 3rd, 1658, Oliver Cromwell lay dying in Whitehall Palace, his organs failing one by one while a violent storm raged outside. His physicians would later cut open his corpse and find something so disturbing in his spleen that they described it as looking like the Lees of Oyl, the thick dark deposits that settle at the bottom of an oil jar. But here's what makes this death truly extraordinary. Cromwell might have lived if he'd taken the one medicine that could save him. The cure existed, it was available. His doctors knew about it. Yet as the Lord Protector's body consumed itself with fever, the medicine sat untouched, because it came from his most hated enemies. To understand why England's most powerful man died the way he did, we need to go back 9 years, to the moment a disease first entered his bloodstream that would never leave it. 1649, and Cromwell is marching through the marshlands of southern Ireland. The ground squelches beneath his boots, the air thick with moisture and the buzz of mosquitoes. He's there to crush Catholic resistance, to impose Protestant rule with the sword. Within weeks he'll oversee the massacres at Drogheda and Wexford that would stain his name forever. But Ireland would have its revenge in a way no one expected. The fever struck him that October, leaving him, in his own words, very sick and crazy in my health. The Irish marshes had given him what physicians called tertian ague, what we now know as malaria. The parasites entered his bloodstream through a mosquito bite, burrowing into his liver, multiplying in his red blood cells. And here's the thing about malaria that Cromwell didn't understand. Once it's in you, it never truly leaves. It hides. It waits. It strikes when you're weakest. 2 years later, the disease nearly killed him. From February to June 1651, while campaigning in Scotland, Cromwell lay desperately ill in Edinburgh. The fever was so violent that Parliament dispatched their best physicians from London, a journey that took over a week. Cromwell himself wrote that, "I thought I should have died of this fit of sickness," describing an illness so violent that indeed my nature was not able to bear the weight thereof. Picture this: the man who had toppled the monarchy, who commanded armies that had never lost a battle, reduced to a shivering, sweating wreck in a Scottish castle. His officers gathered outside his chamber, wondering if they should start planning for a successor. The physicians applied leeches, administered purges, tried every remedy in their arsenal. Somehow, he survived. But survival isn't the same as recovery. By 1655, something had changed in Cromwell's appearance that foreign diplomats couldn't help but notice. The Venetian ambassador, writing in cipher to his masters, observed that the Lord Protector looked pulled in appearance, with signs that his health is not stable and perfect. Then he added a detail that seems small but reveals everything. When Cromwell removed his hat in greeting, the hand holding his hat trembled. This is Oliver Cromwell we're talking about, the man who had charged into cannon fire at Marston Moor, who had signed Charles III's death warrant without his hand shaking. Now, at 56, he couldn't hold a hat steady. The tremor was just one symptom of the recurring fevers that struck without warning. Sometimes he'd be fine for months, conducting state business, meeting with his council, reviewing troops, then the disease would return. First came the telltale shivering, even in summer, even beside a roaring fire. Then the fever would spike, sending his temperature soaring until his clothes were drenched with sweat. The cycle would repeat, cold, hot, each phase lasting hours. His physicians called these episodes agues and considered them a natural hazard of English life. What they didn't understand was that each attack was actually billions of malaria parasites bursting from his red blood cells in synchronized waves, triggering his immune system into overdrive. Each bout left him weaker. Each recovery took longer. Meanwhile, Cromwell ruled England with increasing paranoia. He wore armour under his clothes, changed his travel routes at the last minute, slept in different rooms each night. Some historians attribute this to fear of assassination, and given that royalists were actively plotting to kill him, that fear was justified. But consider this: chronic malaria affects the brain. It causes anxiety, paranoia, mood swings. The disease that was slowly killing his body was also affecting his mind. In June 1658, just as London sweltered in an unusually hot summer, Cromwell received word that would shatter him more than any military defeat. His daughter Elizabeth was dying. Elizabeth Claypole, Betty to her family, wasn't just any daughter. At 28, she was Cromwell's favourite child, and everyone knew it. While his other children embraced their father's stern Puritanism, Elizabeth had something different about her. She was known for intervening with her father on behalf of imprisoned royalists, using her influence to secure pardons and reduce sentences. She was, in many ways, his conscience. By late July, Elizabeth lay in Hampton Court Palace, her body ravaged by what physicians suspected was cancer. The timing could not have been crueler. Her younger son Oliver had died just weeks earlier. Imagine being Cromwell, the most powerful man in 3 kingdoms, watching helplessly as his daughter suffered through pain that all his power couldn't ease. Contemporary accounts describe Cromwell spending hours at her bedside, praying, weeping openly, something almost unthinkable for a man of his position in that era. This wasn't the Lord Protector. This was a father watching his child slip away. Servants reported hearing him bargaining with God, offering his own life in exchange for hers. Then came the royalist propaganda spreading the rumour that would follow Cromwell to his own deathbed, that Elizabeth, in her final moments, had turned on her father, that she had accused him of having blood on his hands, begged him to repent for executing the king. Almost certainly this never happened. No reliable witness reported it. But the story spread because people wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe that even Cromwell's own daughter saw him as a monster. On August 6th, Elizabeth died. Her body was taken by barge down the Thames to Westminster Abbey, the same journey her father's corpse would make. Just weeks later, Cromwell followed the barge on horseback, and witnesses said he seemed to age years in that single day. Less than 4 weeks after burying Elizabeth, Cromwell's final battle began, and this enemy couldn't be defeated with cavalry charges or artillery. It started innocuously enough. At the end of July, court observers noted the Lord Protector was suffering from gout. Nothing unusual there. Gout was practically a badge of honour among England's elite. Proof that you ate rich food and drank good wine. But within days, everyone could see this was different. The pattern was terrifying in its familiarity. The fever returned, but this time with a vengeance. 5 distinct attacks would strike him between late July and September the 3rd, each one worse than the last. Between attacks, he would seem to recover, even conducting state business from his bed. These false recoveries were cruel, giving hope to his supporters, allowing his enemies to think he might survive after all. Let me paint you a picture of what these attacks actually looked like based on eyewitness accounts. First came the shivering, so violent that the bed frame shook. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. Servants piled blankets on him, stoked the fires higher, but nothing could warm him. Then, as suddenly as it started, the cold phase would end and the heat would begin. His temperature would spike. Without thermometers, they couldn't measure it, but physicians noted his skin was burning to the touch. The sweating was profuse, soaking through his nightshirt, the bedsheets, even the mattress. Servants had to change his bedding multiple times a night. Then came the vomiting and diarrhea, so severe that he could keep nothing down, not even water. His throat became raw from the constant retching. A persistent cough developed, bringing up bloody sputum. But the worst part was the pain. Cromwell, who had suffered battle wounds without complaint, cried out in agony. He described feeling like his back and stomach were being torn apart from inside. Modern medical analysis suggests this was likely his spleen swelling, as it tried to filter out the massive numbers of damaged red blood cells, pressing against other organs. Between the attacks, his mind would clear somewhat. He would dictate letters, discuss succession plans with his council, even joke with his physicians. But each recovery was weaker than the last. Each attack left him with less strength to fight the next one. Here's where Cromwell's death becomes not just tragic, but darkly ironic. By 1658, European medicine had discovered a cure for malarial fevers. It was called cinchona bark, or Jesuit's powder, because Jesuit missionaries in Peru had learned about it from indigenous peoples and brought it back to Europe. The medicine worked. It had saved countless lives across Catholic Europe. The active ingredient, what we now call quinine, specifically targeted the malaria parasites in the bloodstream. A few doses could break the fever cycle and save a dying patient. Cromwell's physicians knew about it. They could have obtained it. England had trade connections, and medicine crossed religious boundaries all the time. The powder that could save the Lord Protector's life was probably available within a day's ride of his deathbed. But according to multiple historical sources, Cromwell refused to take it. The word Jesuit was enough. This was the man who had slaughtered Irish Catholics, who had banned Catholic worship in England, who saw the Pope as literally the Antichrist, to accept medicine discovered by Jesuits, distributed by Jesuits, named after Jesuits. It would be betraying everything he believed in. Think about that for a moment. You're dying. You know you're dying. Your body is failing, your daughter is dead, your republic is fragile, a cure exists. But taking it would mean accepting help from your worst enemies, the people you've spent your life fighting. What do you choose? Now, some historians argue this refusal never happened, that it's a myth created by later writers to make Cromwell look foolish. They point out that contemporary medical records don't definitively confirm he was offered the medicine, but what we know for certain is that he didn't receive it. Whether because he refused it, or because his Protestant physicians wouldn't prescribe popish powder, Oliver Cromwell died of a disease that had become treatable. By September 2nd, everyone close to Cromwell knew the end was near. His valet, Charles Harvey, stayed by his bedside, recording his master's final words and prayers. These records give us an intimate window into Cromwell's last hours, and they're nothing like what his enemies expected. The night before he died, Harvey offered him something to drink. Cromwell's response was haunting. "It is not my design to drink or to sleep, but my design is to make what haste I can to be gone." He knew he was ready. But even as his body failed, Cromwell's mind remained sharp enough to wrestle with his legacy. 2 days before the end, witnesses recorded a remarkable prayer that shows he understood exactly how history might remember him. "Lord, though I am a miserable and wretched creature, I am in covenant with thee through grace, and I will come to thee for thy people. Thou hast made me, though very unworthy, a mean instrument to do them some good." Then came the line that surprises everyone who thinks of Cromwell as a tyrant without conscience. "And many of them have set too high a value upon me, though others wish and would be glad of my death." He knew. He knew that half of England wanted him dead, that they saw him as a usurper, a regicide, a murderer, and here's what really stands out. He prayed for those enemies. "Pardons such as desire to trample upon the dust of a poor worm, for they are thy people too." The man who had shown no mercy at Drogheda, who had signed Charles I's death warrant without hesitation, spent his last coherent hours praying for the people who hated him. The date itself carried massive significance. September 3rd was Cromwell's lucky day, the anniversary of his greatest military victories at Dunbar in 1650 and Worcester in 1651. He had often said that God had marked this date for him. Now it would mark his end. The final attack began on September the 2nd and accelerated through the night. By morning, Cromwell could barely speak. Witnesses describe him mumbling about God's will, about England's future, but the words were increasingly incoherent. The fever had finally reached his brain. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the exact time varies depending on the source, Oliver Cromwell died. He was 59 years old. He had ruled England for 5 years, commanded armies for 15, and changed the course of British history forever. Outside Whitehall Palace, a massive storm was raging. Winds that witnesses called unprecedented for September tore through London, toppling trees, ripping roofs off houses. The storm was so severe that it entered folklore. Royalists claimed it was the devil himself come to collect Cromwell's soul. His supporters said it was God mourning the loss of his faithful servant. More likely, it was just a coincidence, a September gale that happened to arrive at a dramatic moment. But the storm would become part of the legend, inseparable from the death itself. The very next morning, before the sun had fully risen, physicians arrived to perform an autopsy on the Lord Protector's corpse. The procedure was carried out by Dr. George Bate, Cromwell's personal physician, the same man some historians suspect was a secret royalist who might have hastened his patient's death. What they found inside Cromwell's body was revealing and repulsive in equal measure. The brain, Bate recorded, had overheated. The vessels were overcharged. In modern terms, this suggests severe inflammation and possibly cerebral edema. The lungs were engorged with fluid, which explains the coughing and difficulty breathing in his final days, but it was the spleen that told the real story. While normal in size, it was filled with matter that looked like the Lees of Oyl, that thick black sludge that settles at the bottom of oil containers. This description has fascinated medical historians for centuries. Modern physicians recognise this as potentially indicating severe sepsis or the aftermath of repeated malarial attacks. The spleen, which filters damaged blood cells, had essentially become a repository of cellular debris from years of disease. The autopsy was, by Bate's own later admission, badly carried out. They were looking for poison. Rumours were already spreading that Cromwell had been murdered. They found disease instead. After the autopsy came the embalming, and this is where things went horribly wrong. The embalmers wrapped Cromwell's corpse in 6 layers of waxed cerecloth, placed it in a lead shell, then enclosed it in a wooden coffin packed with sweet herbs. A gilt copper plate was affixed to the lid with a Latin inscription, identifying him as Oliver, Protector of the Republics. Within days, it became clear that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the preservation process. Multiple sources confirmed that the body swelled and bursted. The putrefaction was so severe that the stench became unbearable, even through the multiple layers of wrapping and the sealed lead shell. Think about what this means. The most powerful man in Britain, whose state funeral was being planned as one of the most elaborate in English history, was rotting so badly that he had to be secretly buried to hide the smell. Between September 4th and September 23rd, probably around September 10th, Cromwell's actual corpse was quietly interred in Westminster Abbey. No ceremony, no witnesses from the public, just a quick burial to stop the stench from spreading, but the state funeral couldn't be cancelled. Too much had been invested, politically and financially. The solution was audacious in its deception. They would hold the funeral anyway, just without the body. Thomas Simon, the renowned medalist, had taken a death mask of Cromwell's face shortly after he died. Working quickly, he had to disguise the saw marks where the skull had been opened during autopsy, using pads beneath the eyelids to make the sunken eyes appear more lifelike. From this mask, craftsmen created an elaborate effigy, a wooden body with a wax face, dressed in purple robes of state. From September 18th to November 10th, this dummy lay in state at Somerset House. Thousands of people filed past, paying their respects, never knowing they were viewing an elaborate fake. The effigy was so convincing that foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments about viewing Cromwell's body. The actual funeral procession on November 23rd was one of the most elaborate in English history. It took 7 hours to travel just over a mile through London. The empty coffin, remember, the real body was already buried, was accompanied by the effigy, thousands of mourners, representatives from every level of government. The whole spectacle cost a fortune, money the Commonwealth could barely afford. John Evelyn, the royalist diarist who attended, wrote with bitter sarcasm, "It was the joyfullest funeral that ever I saw, for there was none that cried, but dogs, which the soldiers hooted away with a barbarous noise, drinking and taking tobacco in the streets as they went." Cromwell's body lay in Westminster Abbey for less than 3 years. When Charles II, son of the king Cromwell had helped execute, was restored to the throne in 1660, Parliament demanded vengeance. They couldn't kill Cromwell, but they could defile his corpse. On January 26, 1661, parliamentary agents came to Westminster Abbey with a specific mission: exhume the bodies of the leading regicides. It took considerable effort to remove Cromwell's body from its vault in Henry VII's chapel. The wood and cloth had partially fused together in decomposition, making it difficult to extract. The corpse, along with those of his son-in-law Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw, was taken to the Red Lion Inn in Holborn. There, in a grotesque display, the bodies spent the night under guard while crowds gathered outside, eager for tomorrow's spectacle. January 30th, 1661, they chose the date deliberately. It was the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution. The 3 decomposed corpses, in open coffins, were dragged on a sledge through London streets to Tyburn, where common criminals were hanged. The crowds that gathered were enormous. This was revenge as public theatre. At Tyburn, the bodies were hanged from the triple tree gallows and left suspended from morning until 4 in the afternoon. When they were finally cut down, the executioner began the grisly work of decapitation. Cromwell's corpse, 3 years dead and partially mummified, required 8 blows to sever the head from the body. The headless corpses were thrown into a pit beneath the gallows, the common burial ground for executed criminals, but the heads received special treatment. They were impaled on 20-foot oak poles and raised above Westminster Hall, where they would remain for decades as a warning to any who might challenge the crown. Cromwell's head stayed on that pike above Westminster Hall for more than 20 years, slowly mummifying in the London air, becoming a grotesque landmark sometime around 1684 to 1688. The exact date is disputed. A great storm finally blew it down. A guard allegedly found it, recognised what it was, and hid it in his chimney. What followed was a bizarre 300-year odyssey. The head passed through the hands of various collectors and showmen. In the 18th century, it was displayed in a museum of curiosities. By the 19th century, it was being exhibited for money. Pay sixpence to see the head of the tyrant Cromwell. The head was sold and resold, authenticated and re-authenticated. Scientists examined it, historians debated it. Finally, in 1960, it was buried at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, Cromwell's old college. The exact location is secret to prevent vandalism. After 300 years, Oliver Cromwell's head finally found peace. Modern physicians studying the records have different theories about what killed Cromwell. The consensus points to malaria, specifically a severe form called malignant tertian malaria, possibly complicated by other infections. Dr. Sanjay Saint from the University of Michigan proposed in 2015 that Cromwell had both chronic malaria and typhoid fever, which together overwhelmed his system. The evidence fits. The cyclical fevers over many years, the pattern of attacks, the enlarged spleen found at autopsy, the vulnerability following emotional stress from his daughter's death. The malaria parasites he picked up in Ireland in 1649 had been waging war in his bloodstream for 9 years. By 1658, his body simply couldn't fight anymore. What makes this medically fascinating is that Cromwell's case shows how malaria operates as a chronic disease. It doesn't always kill quickly. Instead, it weakens the host over years, hiding in the liver between attacks, gradually destroying the body's ability to recover. Each fever cycle damages more red blood cells, puts more strain on the organs, leaves the victim more vulnerable to other infections. Cromwell's death wasn't just about disease. It was a perfect storm of factors that came together in the summer of 1658. The emotional devastation of Elizabeth's death weakened his psychological defences. The stress of maintaining power in an increasingly unstable political situation affected his immune system. The refusal or inability to access quinine treatment sealed his fate. Consider what was happening politically as Cromwell lay dying. His son Richard was weak and unready to rule. The army was growing restless. Royalist plots were everywhere. The Commonwealth that Cromwell had built through violence and held together through force of personality was already starting to crack. Perhaps on some level, his body knew what his mind wouldn't admit. The revolution was failing. There's something almost mythological about Cromwell dying on September 3rd, his day of providence becoming his day of death. His supporters saw divine symbolism, his enemies saw divine justice. The timing was so perfect that some historians have wondered if the date was manipulated, if he actually died on September 2nd or 4th and the record was changed. But the contemporary accounts are consistent. September 3rd, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The contrast between Cromwell's power in life and powerlessness in death is striking. This was a man who had dissolved Parliament with soldiers, who had made Europe's monarchs tremble, who had built a navy that challenged Dutch supremacy and Spanish power, yet he died unable to keep down water, his body consuming itself while a cure potentially sat just out of reach. His corpse, which should have received the grandest funeral in English history, instead rotted so badly it had to be hidden. The elaborate state funeral that did occur was performed for a dummy, a waxen wood substitute dressed in his clothes. Even in death, Cromwell was replaced by a fake version of himself. Then came the posthumous execution, dragged through the streets, hanged like a common criminal, beheaded with 8 messy blows. The man who had overseen the first public execution of an English king suffered his own public execution 3 years after dying. His head, stuck on a pike for 20 years, became a tourist attraction, a curiosity, eventually a collector's item sold for profit. If Cromwell had taken the Jesuits' powder, if he had lived even 5 more years, English history might have unfolded completely differently. His son Richard might have had time to establish himself. The Commonwealth might have stabilised. The monarchy might never have been restored, or at least not restored so quickly and completely. But disease doesn't care about politics or power. The malaria parasites multiplying in Cromwell's bloodstream didn't know they were killing the Lord Protector. They were just following their biological imperative: reproduce, spread, survive. In killing Cromwell, they killed the Commonwealth. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 was, in many ways, made possible by a mosquito bite in an Irish marsh in 1649. This is what makes Cromwell's death so historically significant. It wasn't an assassination, wasn't a battle lost, wasn't even old age. It was disease, preventable, treatable disease, that ended England's republican experiment and restored the crown. Cromwell's death was horrific by any measure. The physical suffering, the recurring fevers, the pain, the delirium, the emotional anguish, losing his daughter, knowing his enemies celebrated his agony. The medical tragedy, dying of something that could have been cured if not for religious prejudice. The posthumous humiliation, the rotting, the fake funeral, the exhumation, the hanging, the beheading, his head on a pike for 20 years. Yet through it all, something of Cromwell's character comes through in those deathbed prayers recorded by his valet, the prayers for his enemies, the acknowledgement that many wished him dead, the concern for England's future rather than his own suffering. Whatever else Cromwell was, and historians still debate whether he was hero or villain, he died as he lived, thinking of himself as God's instrument, concerned with providence and the state of the nation. The storm that raged as he died has become legend, but the real storm was in his body, the final fatal fever that broke on September 3rd, 1658. When it passed, it took with it not just Oliver Cromwell, but the entire English Commonwealth. Within 2 years, the monarchy was restored, and Cromwell's corpse was hanging from Tyburn gallows. His head's 300-year journey from pike to museum to curiosity shop to final burial is perhaps the perfect metaphor for how history has treated Cromwell himself, unable to let him rest, constantly re-examining, reinterpreting, literally holding him up for inspection. Even now, the location of his head's burial is secret, as if even in the 21st century Oliver Cromwell remains too controversial to rest in peace. The horrific final days of Oliver Cromwell remind us that power, no matter how absolute, cannot defeat death. The Lord Protector, who had conquered kingdoms, couldn't conquer the parasites in his own blood, and in the end the medicine that might have saved him, the Jesuits' powder, stands as a monument to how prejudice and hatred can literally kill us. Cromwell died as he had lived, uncompromising to the end, even when compromise might have saved his life.